The big question, bobber or poser? Right in front of me stands the Benda Napoleonbob 500. A mighty name, but does it live up to it? Let's find out. A machine like this Benda here is best imagined in a truly stunning setting, not in Wiener Neustadt. And that's why we're here. We're near Barcelona, in Castelldefels. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And yes, we've got palm trees, sunshine, and a cool backdrop to do justice to its look. When you see it, your first thought isn't, wow, this thing is super fast and takes corners like a dream. And that's probably not why you'd have it in your garage or parked outside your house either. Visually, it really makes a statement. It's quite opulent, it's imposing, it leaves an impression. Of course, I was very curious, how does it actually perform? That's why we titled this Bobber or Poser. Also, with the name Benda, there's a fun little wordplay in there. We had the Napoleonbob with us for 1 week and tested it in this beautiful Spanish setting to find out what's really under the hood. The most important part, the heart of the bike, the engine. We actually had a bit of a laugh when we looked at it because it doesn't really look like a 500 cubic centimeter engine. It could easily be sitting inside a big hefty Harley. So what exactly do we have here? Of course, it's a V-twin engine with 500 cubic centimeters. Well, approximately 475 as figures vary, but 475 is what we were told. It's liquid cooled and delivers 48 horsepower with 45 Newton meters of torque. I'll get into throttle response later, but I can already say this isn't ride-by-wire, it's still an older cable throttle. We've got a really massive wheelbase here, 1,550 millimeters. That's quite rare in this class, but I think it fits the overall picture really well. It's cool though, you do notice it in the corners, but I'll go into more detail on that later. Another interesting aspect is the seat height, which is 695 millimeters. So it's really accessible for riders of all leg lengths and body sizes. If I move my foot forward here, you really get that typical bobber position. You're stretched out and slightly hunched over. The single seat, which you've probably seen on 1 or 2 other models, really adds to the overall look and fits perfectly with the aesthetics. As for the riding position, I have to say it was definitely an adjustment. Coming from the upright stance of other test bikes to the Benda, I was like, okay, this is something else, but it's fun. It gives off a certain vibe. If I may put it in Gen Z terms, it's a feeling you just don't get from anything else. However, I have to admit, if I imagine doing a 300-kilometer day trip on this bike, my back, at just 23 years old, would already start to hurt a bit. Moving on to tire dimensions. At the front, we've got 150 by 80 on 16-inch wheels, and at the rear it's 180 by 65, also on 16-inch wheels. These are from Temsung, a brand that's relatively unknown in Europe, and the specific model is the Axle Beyond. Now, for those who hate chain maintenance, you'll be happy to hear this bike has a belt drive. So it's a bit simpler and requires less upkeep. The braking setup consists of a single 320mm disc at the front and a 260mm single disc at the rear. Of course, on a cruiser or bobber, the braking balance isn't quite like on a typical naked bike, where most of the braking power is focused on the front. Switching on the ignition brings us straight to the LCD display. The only downside? Ideally, you have to stop and take off your gloves because the screen only works with bare hands, not with gloves, even touchscreen compatible ones. You can cycle through different trip settings, and over here on the handlebar, there's a button to toggle traction control on and off, but that's the only extra feature. Suspension-wise, things get interesting. At the front, we have 100 millimeters of travel, and at the rear, Benda claims it's 30 millimeters. That's a bit hard to imagine, and we'll have to find out through riding whether that's really accurate. And if it is, just how stiff is it? I already hinted at it briefly. I handed the bike over to Valentin to get his take on it.
Hi all!
I'd like to bring Valentin in on this as well, since we both had the chance to test the bike. And of course, it's always interesting for you to know how a bike feels on an individual level. We're a man and a woman, we have different heights, and naturally that means we each experience the ride differently. That's why I think it's valuable to share how our impressions differed on specific aspects of the bike. So I'll just dive right in, and Valentin, you can jump in at any point, whether to share what you experienced differently or to confirm if you felt the same way.
All right, I'll see if I need to step in or if I agree with everything. But let's get started. So, Amelie, how was it in the saddle of the Benda Napoleonbob?
Visually, I was super excited about it the moment I saw it. And honestly, this is the first bike I've ever ridden with this kind of seating position, a proper classic bobber. And just in terms of the feeling, I have to say it's definitely got something special. You kind of feel cool, you're sitting there cruising through the city, and it definitely grabs attention. As for the seat itself, I actually found it really comfortable. No issues at all in that regard, but the stretched out riding position, especially with your arms, means you don't really have any room to adjust. Normally on other bikes you can sit in a more relaxed way, but that's just not the case here. And I think if you don't have a particularly strong back, which to be honest I don't, after a few 100 kilometers, maybe 200, it could start to feel quite tiring. So let me know, did you feel the same way? Do you think it can get a bit demanding over time?
All right, I'll just hop on so people out there can see what it looks like when a rider of 1,87 m and a solid 99 kilos sits on this bike. You can already see that the rear suspension compresses quite a bit, but overall it's fine. In fact, I think being taller actually helps a bit with the stretched out riding position. I don't have particularly long arms, probably just average for my height. And the foot pegs aren't positioned all the way forward like on a Harley. They're set in a way that still allows for a somewhat active riding style. So at 1,87 m, I actually feel quite comfortable on it. Shall we jump straight into the riding experience, Amelie? Let's talk about the suspension. When I first saw the spec sheet, I could hardly believe it. 30 millimeters of rear suspension travel, and on top of that, it's tucked away in here. You actually need a special key to unlock it, and then you can adjust the preload with a hook spanner. That's the only thing you can tweak on the entire suspension setup. To be honest, it's not the most practical system, and we ran into an issue. We didn't even have the hook spanner since it wasn't included with the bike. So we ended up riding with the factory setting, which I believe was on the minimum preload. As a result, I bottomed out extremely early, maybe even earlier than you did. How was it for you in terms of lean angle clearance?
Well, it's definitely tricky, especially if you are used to a naked bike where you can easily lean into corners or make quick U-turns. Everything just happens so effortlessly. Here, though, you can probably see it in the background. We've got a lot of steep sections. Going uphill is still manageable. You can roll forward a bit and then let yourself roll back. But when you actually need to turn around and try to lean slightly to speed up the process, you end up having to go forward, then back, then forward again. You have to make these little adjustments constantly. And that's mainly because the foot pegs are set so low. Plus, underneath the engine, the frame scrapes the ground really quickly.
Exactly, and that's actually one of my main concerns from a safety perspective. Scraping the foot peg feelers is one thing, but literally just a fraction of a degree later, the frame is already hitting the ground. And that's especially risky when you're riding over uneven surfaces in a corner. If you bottom out, your tires can still have plenty of grip, but the moment they lose contact with the ground, even briefly, it's game over, and that's that. From a comfort standpoint though, I actually found it okay. I honestly think there's more than 30 millimeters of rear suspension travel. I'll just say it. There's still some movement happening at the rear. And as you mentioned, this riding style is a whole new category for you. I think a lot of people out there probably haven't ridden a cruiser before either. It's definitely something you have to get used to, but that's not really unique to Benda. It's just the nature of this type of bike. As for the front suspension, even though the fork isn't adjustable and it's hidden behind these decorative ornament-like covers that give it a really distinctive look, it actually does a solid job. It's not overly noticeable, which in my opinion is a good thing. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. In terms of the suspension, I never really felt like I needed to make any major adjustments. And the rear wasn't uncomfortable either. Like you said, 30 millimeters, it's really hard to believe that's actually the case. Now, looking forward at the front wheel, the brakes, what was your impression? I felt like there could have been a bit more happening up front, even considering the different braking balance.
Yes, so it's clearly a single disc at the front. The bike weighs 190 kilos, but we don't actually know if that's dry weight or fully fueled. It's not really specified anywhere. Given the hefty build, I'd guess it's more likely dry weight. With that in mind, a single front disc is already working pretty hard. It's 320 millimeters, and in my opinion, it doesn't break badly at all. But of course, there are natural limits to what it can do. That's why I think it's even more important that the rear brake actually contributes something as well. And in this case, the braking is well distributed. When you combine engine braking, the front brake and the rear brake, especially going downhill, I never once felt like the setup was undersized for the bike. Of course, it's not a high-performance braking system. We can probably all agree on that. But given the limited lean angle, you're never really in a situation where you'd want to brake aggressively and throw the bike into a deep lean. That's just not something this bike is designed for. So for its class and the type of bike it is, I think the braking setup is well matched.
I find it interesting as well because, to be honest, I'm used to braking mostly with the front brake. And when you switch from a naked bike or any other model to a cruiser or a bobber, it's actually a good learning experience.
Absolutely. And I think the rear brake is especially important here because, and this brings me to the engine and throttle response, we are simply not used to this kind of setup anymore. This bike has a traditional throttle cable, nothing fancy, and it's a bit rough in its response. To compensate, I use the clutch a little, of course, but I also rely on the rear brake to help manage tighter corners like the ones we've been riding here. It allows me to modulate my speed and sort of glide around the bends, because if you try to control everything purely with the throttle, it requires an incredibly delicate touch. Even then, it's difficult to apply power smoothly, since there's always this slight jerky moment when the drivetrain re-engages and the bike moves forward. Apart from that, I think the engine, for its 48 horsepower, actually makes sense. I never felt underpowered. Of course, riding 2 up would be a different story, but that's not really an option on this bike anyway. So, as it is, the power delivery works well. And with the low seat height, it also makes the bike accessible to a broader range of potential riders. Amelie, what's your take on the sound? I thought it was really cool.
Oh, absolutely. It's got this really nice throaty rumble. We even rode along a promenade at one point, and you could literally see people turning their heads like, wow.
I was just riding behind Amelie, and the vibration actually shook a screw loose. Must have been those organ-like sound checks, right, Amelie? It's not a big deal, you can just pop it back in, but without the screw, it's definitely not going to hold for long. We'll have to check at home if we have a screw that fits. What's a bit strange though, Amelie, you know the technical term for this, so I have to ask you, the frame has this kind of uneven surface. I don't want to say wrinkled because that sounds awful, but even at the front, around the headstock, it looks kind of, well, let's just say not entirely smooth.
Exactly. At first I thought it looked like it came out of a 3D printer because of the texture, but apparently it's meant to be wrinkle paint, a finish designed to have that creased effect. So we're curious, what do you all think? Do you think it fits the overall look? It was advertised as part of the bike's design, meant to add a bit of uniqueness. Personally, I think if they had just used regular paint, like on the other parts, I would have preferred it. I feel like it would have looked a bit more premium that way.
Yes, I also think a simple black finish, maybe matte black, would have been more than enough. End of story. Because overall, I think the bike looks really good. The lines work well, and the pinstripes on the tank, even though they're just stickers, blend in nicely with the overall design. It definitely catches the eye. And honestly, when I saw you riding along the coast in Casteldefels, where we're staying with the sea in the background, I thought, okay, this could be straight out of a US movie. Palm trees, beach, and that classic cruiser vibe. And for this price, that's where we can transition into features and value because, as you mentioned, for what you get, this is great bang for your buck. As the Americans say, you really get something for your money. It has a low maintenance belt drive, it's a cool all-around package, and there's really nothing else quite like it on the market. Of course, Benda takes a lot of design inspiration from bigger brands. Many elements look familiar in some way, but as a complete package, it's a bold move and a strong first impression in this segment. And honestly, I've grown really fond of the Benda Napoleonbob. I even made a moto vlog with it. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel now. You'll get it delivered straight to you when it's out. Amelie, do you have any final thoughts on the Napoleonbob?
I'd also say that visually it's definitely an eye-catcher. It's something special. You don't see it everywhere. So that's already a thumbs up from me. And in terms of the engine and riding experience, it's something you really have to try for yourself. It's completely unique. Maybe some of you out there have ridden a bobber once and never wanted anything else again. Or maybe it's just not your thing at all. But for the occasional short trip, I'd definitely give it another go. Just one small note, if I do, I'll definitely be wearing a rain cover on this bike. Because with the license plate holder and the rear wheel cover, it's a bit, well, let's just say, not exactly ideal for keeping you dry.
Amelie, you're being way too polite. Let me put it straight. I sat on this bike when it was wet and I was soaked from my neck all the way down to places I'd rather not mention. It was not fun. I looked like a mess after just 10 to 15 minutes of riding back and forth here. No, seriously, the rear rain protection is an absolute disaster. If you're planning to buy this bike, you need to do something about it, or just only ride when it's dry, then it doesn't matter. So that being said, Benda is definitely a cool new brand on the market. They also have a 700, which comes with this absurdly wide rear tire. I think it's a 270mm rear tire. If you'd like to see a review of that one, make sure to hit the like button and let us know in the comments what you think of the Napoleonbob. And with that, we're signing off from Spain with a big adios and bye-bye.